So just to look at the quick agenda for today, I'll be addressing the first half of the presentation, looking at our 12 accountability commitments very quickly and why we address the environment in these accountability commitments. I'll also just look over some challenges that we as CSOs are facing in the context of environmental accountability and how we can overcome these challenges. Then Anastasia from MioXA, who is joining me today, will be looking at more specifically how to demonstrate accountability to the environment in your organization by looking at the day-to-day functions of your office and how to organize sustainable events. And then afterwards, we'll hopefully have some minutes to hear from you or have a small discussion on the points that we raise. And it would also be interesting to hear what your experience is as well, working in your civil society organization and how your organization is approaching the issue of the environment. So like I said, we have Anastasia with us from MioXA. I will leave her to describe her MioXA and her organization just before she starts her presentation. But just a small bit of information about Accountable Now. We are, as some of you may know, are a membership-based organization, and we work with leading international civil society organizations on improving and changing accountability practices in the civil society sector. And we work closely with our members on improving their accountability practices through our accountability reporting process. And we also work on a number of projects with various organizations from around the world on researching and testing new accountability methods and mechanisms in different contexts. So that's us in a very, very small nutshell. There's a lot more to say, but yeah, for today, I think it would just be nice to explore with you how CSOs can begin to improve their practices so that they can, or you can, increase your accountability towards the stakeholder that's often forgotten, the environment. So to begin, I'll give you some background context on what we mean by accountability at Accountable Now. We've based our approach and work upon the Global Standards 12 accountability commitments. This is the small image that you see on the screen illustrating the 12 commitments, and they act as our framework for the work that we do internally and also with our members. And we promote this approach of accountability to our network, and we also ask our members to report against these 12 commitments and strive to achieve them as much as possible. And they entail larger aspirational goals, approaches to such as approaches to wider structural change, and also they look at how to improve internal practices as well. But today we focus on one commitment in particular, the third Healthy Planet accountability commitment, which states we will protect will protect the natural environment and enhance its ability to support life for future generations. And it's a commitment that can be often overlooked, with CSOs often facing time and resource struggles. We know that it can be too easily left as the environment can too easily be left as a last consideration. But in the search for clean, healthy, and sustainable policies and practices that do benefit the people that we work with and for, as well as the planet, we must and we really should develop and implement strategies that contribute to the protection of the natural environment so that we can achieve our strategic goals without negatively impacting the environment. So some challenges that CSOs face in relation to environmental accountability and things that we may have experienced ourselves is that CSOs are increasingly under pressure under greater scrutiny to demonstrate that they're using resources efficiently, accountably, and transparently. There are more eyes upon us to ensure we're not wasting resources, and pressure comes from the public and media and the government, and it's something that we have to be aware and careful of in our work. And something which we may have noticed as well is that there can be a gap between the campaigns of climate change that many organizations do and the organization's own environmental performance, which can trigger credibility issues. And we've seen like the great work that was done for the climate strike campaigns, and generally there is amazing work being done to promote civil society coming together and promoting better practices towards the environment. but we do have to look honestly at ourselves as a sector, as individuals and organizations, and as organizations as a whole. Are our day-to-day activities in line with what we promote, and could we be doing better? So we need to start walking the talk. Thirdly, donors are increasingly demanding data on environmental performance, such as CEDA and DFID. So this, again, is something that CSOs need to consider. And lastly, the work we do is impacted by climate change. We aim to change the lives of people and communities around the world, and our stakeholders, those who need support from civil society, and us ourselves will feel the impact of climate change. And it's only going to make it harder to achieve our visions and goals. And we have to attempt to create change within our organizations as well as outside if we are to mitigate the impact of the climate crisis. But how can we overcome these challenges? And there are many ways, of course, and these challenges are big and they address very large structural topics which no environmental policy will solve completely. But for the moment, we need to make change in our own organizations, and we think at Accountable Now that this can be done through accountability to some extent. So accountability guides the actions of civil society organizations towards being more socially and environmentally sustainable. Those communities and stakeholders and those people who work with us and who we work for, as I said, would be impacted by the climate crisis. Therefore, CSOs do need to engage with dynamic accountability principles that are set out in our 12 commitments. And this will bring those voices who are affected by climate change into decision-making processes. In that way, the environment can be taken into account in our own work, and CSOs can begin to think about resource management. They can begin to walk the talk. They can prove to donors they are making efforts to mitigate negative environmental impacts. And hopefully this has some impact to change the course we are currently on. But how can we become accountable to the environment? I think firstly, we need to establish values. Your organization needs to establish values. Have discussions with your colleagues, with your superiors, with your peers. What goals do you want to achieve? And how does the environment come into play? And how, while achieving these goals, can you take into account the need to promote a healthy planet? Secondly, a more practical tool, which I would like to show you today, is the global standard for accountability guidance materials. This is a practical tool, which I'll show you in just a bit, that can help you map out where and how your organization is already acting upon our environmental accountability commitment and where it can improve. And so together with this value basis and with this understanding of your organization provided by the guidance materials, this can help you establish the foundation of your environmental policy and hopefully influence individual decision-making in your organization and encourage sustainable and environmentally conscious behavior. But just a quick look at the guidance materials. These materials, they give a brief insight into how CSOs can assess and change their practices so as to reach and demonstrate commitment to the 12 accountability commitments. There is a 3-step process. You can monitor your progress and you can implement the 12 accountability commitments and understand how accountability activities can contribute to improved practices. So just to quickly show you what I mean by the guidance materials, this link will be shared afterwards after the webinar. But if I get it up here, this is the global standard for CSO accountability website, where we have developed a new web page for these interactive guidance materials. And these guidance materials were developed from previously PDF document, and this web page aims to be a little bit more interesting and interactive. And here you can understand how to implement each of our 12 accountability commitments. We have a 3-step process, looking at the processes, policies, and structure of an organization, looking at stakeholder feedback, and lastly, giving you some guiding questions. So if we go to the first cluster A, which is the first cluster of our 12 accountability commitments, you'll see that we have our 3rd accountability commitment, Healthy Planet, here. And here we state what the accountability commitment is, and what some key actions you can do are. And here there is a small box and giving you some food for thought, posing you some questions of what you can think about when trying to understand how accountable your organization is already to the environment. So you can flick through these boxes, look at what your organization is doing already, consider whether or not you are doing this, look at the stakeholders, whether or not you feel that your stakeholders are believe that you are fulfilling these points. And lastly, you have some guiding questions which can help you reflect on the work of your organization. And together, these guidance materials can provide a backdrop for you to improve your environmental accountability and help you kickstart the development of an environmental policy. Just go back to the presentation. So just give me a second. Okay. So with this value basis and this practical tool, you can, if you have not yet got an environmental policy in your organization, there are some basic steps that you can fulfill to begin the process. Firstly, you have to, it depends on how your organization manages policy making, but if you're an individual who firstly wants to kick this off and propose something to your organization and your colleagues, you need to start working together and thinking about your mission and values. You need to understand why your organization is establishing an environmental policy. This will help you understand the scope and set some realistic goals. You have to commit to want to continually improve. This environmental policy is not going to last for years. It's most likely only going to last for a year or so. And you also have to set your expectations of external parties, those who you work for, those who you work with, those businesses and organizations that support you. Do you want to maintain relationships with these organizations if they have certain environmental standards? Do you want to help them improve their environmental standards as well and promote your own environmental policy to them? You also have to educate and engage your employees, because if this environmental policy is ever going to work, this really depends on the people who work in your organization actually reading it, understanding it, and wanting to implement it. Lastly, some general, because constructing environmental policy is not easy. It's very difficult to know where to start, because your organization is no doubt having impact upon the environment in all ways and at all levels. So for me and for others who I've spoken to when creating an environmental policy, it's very useful to map out the areas of work in your organization. Looking at the internal and the office and the day-to-day, maybe you also host events and meetings. If you do, then this will also include travel. Maybe your organization works in the field and has certain operations taking place across the world. You also will have relationships with businesses and other organizations, and you may also have projects and programs. All of these areas will have different aspects of environmental impact which you will have to address. And for each area of you would have to map out the resources you use and the potential environmental impact that is had by this work. And this webinar would be very difficult to give specific advice on exactly which area of work will have what environmental impact, because this really does depend on each organization. But this is a first step to kind of understand where your organization is standing in environmental policies and to see how where you can improve and how. So you can use this information to start defining policies. Additionally, you should be creating checklists as well. For example, when you're organizing travel or organizing events or setting up your office and your day-to-day practices. Ensuring that these checklists are followed when you're creating events or going on travel, for example. And you should also commit to monitor this progress and also commit to communicate your policy internally and externally, so that not only your colleagues know about it, but also those who you work with and as well the wider public. So right now, this was the end of my part, giving some kind of background to the context of environmental accountability, and I would like to then hand over to Anastasia from UXD, who will give some more information on specific actions your organization can take to be more environmentally accountable. So Anastasia, I will hand over to you with the presenter control. And you should be able to unmute yourself and discuss with the group.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Bethany. Can you all see the slide now? I hope so. Everyone, I'm glad to be part of this webinar. My name is Anastasia Roniotis, and I'm from this acronym that you see there, which is for Mediterranean Information Office for Environment, Culture, and Sustainable Development. We are a federation of non-governmental organizations working on environment and sustainability in the Mediterranean region. So my part of this presentation and webinar is more focused on some ideas, I guess, some guidance on how to advance a little bit on defining your environmental policy. And I decided after quite a bit of background research, oh, I don't think I can change my slides. Oh, there we are. Okay. I'm going to focus on two aspects which I find are probably the most common for most civil society organizations, regardless of scale, theme, etc. Day-to-day functions in the office and organizing events in the most sustainable way possible. And when discussing sustainability of events, we're covering all aspects of sustainable development. So it's financial, environmental, and social. And all of this will be taking place, taking in full consideration our common restrictions as well. So it's basically budgeting issues, finances, human resources that are restricted, our local realities, because we're all based in different parts of the world with different existing infrastructures that can support us or not in being environmentally light-footed, let's say, and also based, resourced quite a bit on our own experience in a region which is an interface between a European setting and a non-European, North African and Middle Eastern setting. The logic behind being environmentally responsible as CSOs basically has to do with minimizing our so-called footprint, our ecological footprint. I'm not going into the theory or the methodology behind this because it's more complicated than it seems. But this is just for you to know more or less what our calculations in our accounting, what we are requiring and claiming from natural resources in order to function, and what our biological reserves, our ecosystems can actually supply for us to function. So the ecological footprint is more or less a way to calculate this budget. A sad fact is that this year we completely used up our available budget, natural budget, by the 29th of July, according to Global Footprint Network. So this is something that most of us should be aware of, that in 7 months, by the 7 months of the year, we used up all of the natural resources we should have used throughout the whole year. And this is unfortunately creeping up every year. It's coming up earlier and earlier, and this is the earliest date ever. Interestingly, if you see, we in this budgeting effort, we have forests, we have croplands, we have fishing grounds. We also have, of course, what we use up for our transportation, for our urban living spaces. What is not used in this budgeting are deserts, glaciers, and open ocean. So because some people get confused and they assume that, oh, but our oceans are huge. So, but in fact, we don't calculate these in this budget. So anyway, as we speak, we are working on a budget, on a deficit, and it's very important, therefore, to minimize our footprint as much as possible. I can't change my slide again for some reason. Oh, there we go. So going into the day-to-days, I have to say that there is a lot of information online. There is a lot of information, and I would advise anybody preparing to revise or begin an environmental policy to do their research and try to find information that is fit for purpose. What I can do here is just briefly go into some of the basics and some of the most popular categories or minimum categories, let's say, are to begin by measuring your carbon footprint. And again, as I said, there are so many calculators and suggestions online, but our suggestion would be to start simple with things that are relatively easy to monitor. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you purchase your tickets, there should be, at least here in Greece, all of the ticket agencies and companies include the carbon footprint for each flight. So it's easy to calculate for the travel of the organization how much impactful air travel is. Another easy way of trying to budget your carbon footprint is just by taking your bills and starting off from there. Once you set out your first baseline, you can either just compare with the next year after you set in some individual targets, or you can have an overall target that you aim to work toward. Maybe 10 to 15% would be a good start, and you can assess how easily you can reach that, and then maybe become more ambitious after that. When we discuss paper, it may be solved for many organizations, but for others, it's actually not. One can do some basics, which are to regulate printers on double-sided printing, of course, use recycled paper or use paper only when necessary. But you can also go super ambitious without too much of a change in day-to-day life, you would notice, and just declare your offices paperless. If you declare your office as paperless and you have a staff member who is in charge of allocating paper when absolutely necessary, you can actually see if and where paper is absolutely necessary, and then just budget and allocate paper for that use. Surprisingly, we really need very little paper nowadays, since almost everything is electronic. A couple of things that are not so obvious is that as individuals, many of us have elected to have e-bills and not have bills mailed to us. But a lot of organizations and offices forget to do this simply because, you know, the accounting department is not as well informed about a green process, and therefore e-bills keep coming by mail for an organization, and this can actually be very easily adapted because most accounting systems nowadays are also electronic. Another thing where we could reduce paper use as offices is in terms of packaging. We can somewhat help the supply chain, and when we see that packaging is uncomfortably too much, make a note to suppliers or prefer other suppliers. When we come to recycling, I think most of us recycle to a certain extent, but we mustn't forget that before considering recycling, we need to reuse and repair. And I'm talking not just for our waste, you know, paper, plastic, or whatever comes out of an office, but I'm talking also about electronic waste. I know that from country to country, the specifications are very different. And for proper recycling, you need infrastructure, you need certified suppliers, you need a well-functioning municipal service, et cetera, et cetera. But even in countries or cities or cases where you do not have an advanced recycling system, our suggestion would be to actually have your recycling bins very clearly marked and very visible in the office, even just for awareness and even for initiating change. And another tip that recently I read about, which is very useful, is do not have personal bins for the staff underneath their desk, but have centrally located spots, accessible, but centrally located, because you achieve a much better rate of separation and a much better engagement process, and it's much more educational as well. When it comes to electronic devices, consider refurbishing, for example. Consider refurbishing, consider donating. And when it comes to recycling electronics, don't keep them stored for too long before you pass them on to certified recyclers. The more they are stored, then the valuable materials that are within them are not being reused, and therefore the pressure on virgin materials remains very high. Two other aspects where we can make a difference is conserving energy and managing water in the office. I guess conserving energy is relatively obvious, but nevertheless, low-cost options are just seeing where you may be wasting energy and just change those practices. Switch off devices, switch off lights at night, hibernate certain functions, or go one step further and when out of the office, switch off completely, because hibernation also is energy consuming. Simple things like switching to energy saving light bulbs and not neglecting maintenance can make a big difference and are not additional costs to, not considerable additional costs to an organization. If we want to go big and we want to go expensive, and if we have a vision, we could go to double glazing windows, insulation, new energy efficient equipment, total redesign and renovation, and becoming a model green building, for example. But this is something which is not easy for most of us. Even us as an environmental organization, we cannot claim that we have a green building, but it's always worth looking into opportunities of participating in some sort of project or program that may integrate you within that. I also understand that in many countries, nonprofit organizations can't get loans from banks, which makes this even more difficult. Even when you want to perform your best, it's just that the enabling environment isn't really there. Coming to water, a tip we can give is that when tap water is safe, but doesn't taste very good due to chlorine, for staff and visitors to not want to bring water bottles, which increases plastic consumption, or to not have to have these bubble machines or anything like that, it's better to just invest in some water filters that will make tap water better tasting, and you have an overall considerably lower carbon footprint. Going toxic free is not easy, but some simple steps can be taken by any organization and any office, from cleaning products to be less standard chemical, and therefore your contribution to better water and soil and health quality is manifested. If you're a bigger office and you're contracting some company for your cleaning service, check and see what their environmental policy is, and always claim and include in your call for procurement to have environmental friendly products. When it comes to consumables, other consumables in the office, paper should be chlorine free, inks, toners should be certified, and have much less health impacts than the standard ones. And another step, which probably doesn't really cost, is that deliverables of your projects can have built-in requirements and specifications to be environmentally and socially toxic-free and chemical-free. Assessing and monitoring travel. In the time of video conferencing, we really should assess whether a meeting is absolutely necessary. Sometimes when we have to go somewhere for advocacy reasons and have a 10-minute presentation, it may not be worth the carbon footprint. We have seen that a small investment in a good camera, a quiet space, and recording, basic recording facilities, so that you can make a video of your presentation and connect online for the Q&A session, is actually a very good alternative. It's perfectly understandable, however, that face-to-face meetings sometimes are often quite necessary, and travel cannot be avoided, but still we can offset our carbon and participate in schemes that are designed to make reductions in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this also, our participation in such schemes, after careful research, again, I repeat, can contribute in our social contribution, as they usually accommodate for local development. And I guess, as Bethany also pointed out, we need to keep measuring progress. We need to keep reevaluating our footprint, celebrate any achievements, mention it in staff meetings, in board meetings, and of course, highlight it in annual reports. From the challenges that need to be considered in order to be able to implement any of the things mentioned in the previous slide, is that there's a cost involved, and it's not usually accounted for, but it's something that we need to start building into our short and long-term work programs, and in the overall vision of the organization, and also within our project implementations. It's not easy if you're the person tasked within your organization to elevate this aspect of having a more environmental friendly profile, because you have to be convincing. And yeah, there's a lot of information and advice on how to build the statistics and the numbers so that you can be convincing. And always it has to link with cost efficiency, and thankfully working in a sustainable manner is cost effectively, but not necessarily in the short term. Another thing that we cannot always control in our effort is how and what level of performance our partners may have or our suppliers may have. Recently, we co-organized an event, and we thought we had everything planned out, but our local hosts, who were of a culture of extreme hospitality, were not very well aligned with the principles. But in any case, we need to stay motivated. Always start with the low-cost good practices that will give you good results and a good stepping stone for the next level. And anything achieved in such an effort is definitely a step in the right direction. I'm quickly going to go into the second part, which is for sustainable events. I don't know how many of you organize big events, but even in small events, we have found in our experience that it makes a difference. A non-sustainable event and a sustainable event have a big difference on resources, on social impact, and it really shouldn't be undermined. Even the fact that we're continuing to promote bad practices is something our events should not be doing. So when we're talking about a sustainable event, it is one that is designed and performed in a way that both the ecological footprint and the social footprint are strengthened. So it's about impacting the management of our resources and in the end, protecting our natural capital, so our biodiversity. And it doesn't really take you out of what we were discussing earlier in terms of your day-to-day functions within the office. So the 4 R's are there, and what you're working towards is waste, energy, water, and emissions to be minimized. That's basically what we're working towards. And when it comes to any event, these are usually the basic categories that you have to look into. The venue, the transport involved, accommodation, catering, how you're going to be communicating your event and the materials you'll be using, and if it's linked with an exhibition, also the exhibition. Now, I have a whole slew of tips and information on all of these and each of these, and I will only, I don't know, I guess I really shouldn't because time is, I'm a little bit late. So there is so much information online, but I will also send everyone, if Bethany has no problem with this, some tips and ideas that sort of summarize what everyone can do for a sustainable event under each of these categories. And you can all take a look. It's just a personal research and view of this webinar. But again, there's so much information out there that is constantly being updated. On the social aspects of a sustainable event, we, through our catering, our local transportation choices, we can promote local suppliers, local CSOs, small and medium enterprises, and it's very encouraging for those who have invested in being more sustainable in the provision of their services to be rewarded. And we need to promote this kind of activity and this kind of socially conscious practice. And in our choices, by using fair trade, vegetarian, organic, working with CSOs that have infrastructures for other social reasons, but using their infrastructure, like their transportation, for example, facilities. We should be using them in a way that they were supporting their competitive edge and to strengthen this market as a whole. An example is to consider choosing a destination that can boost the local economy. Of course, you need all of the criteria to be met. You need it to be safe. You need many aspects to be met, but it's always a good starting point. And then if you can't do it otherwise, yes, you'll be in a big urban center. You'll be near public transportation. You'll still meet your environmental criteria, but you just won't be contributing to the social aspect of promoting a better quality of human life. And another thing we should always be very respectful of is sometimes we have events in areas and we don't consider the negative impact of noise, for example, if we organize a festival, if we haven't actually have had meetings with the local stakeholders in advance to explain our event. There's so many aspects of accountability and stakeholder engagement involved. So being an agent of change, even if we're not particularly successful, and even though we try to organize sustainable events and they don't end up being that sustainable, still, it does make a difference. If we have our requirements clearly stated in our call for offers and quotes, it sends a message. If we have specifications, we are raising awareness. If we have cutoffs in our procurements, it makes suppliers think and adapt to the new requests. And when you let them know that they were rejected because the sustainability standards were not met, that too makes a difference. We often get such feedback from providers we have worked with as well. So as in building an environmental policy as a whole that Bethany described in the first part of the presentation, you need to plan, you need to involve, you need to train and engage and educate, and you need to monitor. You can go for very high ambitions and plan and set your targets high. That would require more training, training the staff, training suppliers, training your own participants, and engaging them, immersing them into these measures you have taken. And you may need to train chefs, you may need to train other providers with even basic knowledge of how to be more sustainable. And in the end, you may find that some things did not materialize, some things didn't work well, and it will only help for the next meeting to be even better. And finally, in closing, the communication aspects are very important. Sometimes we underestimate them. So we need to be very communicative about what we are trying to do by having a sustainable event or having an environmental policy in place. It may be obvious to us, but it's not obvious to others. We have to think of smart ways of engaging participants, as I mentioned before. Simple ways are returning our badges after an event, but it can be more interactive and more educational with a mini event or a mini exhibition on, I don't know, waste management or some innovation of the event in terms of recycling or something during a coffee break or a lunch break. It would be good to reward the providers of the event that are providing sustainable service. It's good to show this appreciation. Don't let the gifts trap or the handouts of an event pull you in. Outsmart the marketing and be very, very careful and selective of what you will be disseminating during a meeting, both for environmental reasons, but also for social reasons. in the end, in order for all of us to learn from your experience, it would be nice to post the results of your efforts and include it into any kind of reporting you may have. And that's where I will stop, and I apologize for taking more time than I was supposed to.